prepared for this talk, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say, but I've sketched out two main things that I'd like to talk about, and then maybe perhaps we could all discuss afterwards. So I will start by talking for 15 minutes about the life of Leonardo da Vinci, and then I'm going to develop this into a conversation about life today and his relevance to how we live. And because there's obviously overtones with the contemporary artwork, there's quite a few artists here and things like that, I'll also discuss the possible relevance of Da Vinci to the environment that we've inherited in the 60s, so we made Warhol and Perkins and the rest of the Damien Hirst and so on. So I'll try and put it into context. I'll criticise both, so I'll criticise Koons and I'll criticise Da Vinci. And I'll point out paradoxes in the whole thing. So really the subject of this talk is not Leonardo da Vinci. The subject of the talk is genius and the problem of genius and time and authenticity and these sorts of things. So it'll start by me just sort of talking to you about things that you may know very well, but I'm going to colour them a little. So we're going to go back in time to his youth and develop into his old age and try and understand a little about what he was trying to do. And then we're going to leap from that to the present. So we'll start in about 1470s, I suppose. Back in, even go a bit earlier, back to Vinci, where he was born. So, I mean, as I say, some of you will know quite a lot, perhaps, about Leonardo, and will know about flying machines and the Mona Lisa and things, but I'll try and inform you a little about the more obscure things that he was doing. Right, so, to start with, he was a bastard. And that's kind of important, because if you're a bastard in the Italian Renaissance, the 16th century Italy, it's a handicap. And you can't really become a notary or a lawyer or any of these things. You can't inherit, really. So you spend a great deal of time trying to compensate for being a bastard by having to become entertainer. So there is an aspect to Leonardo where he had to become an entertainer. He had to shine. So there had to be a shining about him in a way that perhaps Michelangelo didn't have to make the same effort. So Michelangelo was not entirely his contemporary, 20 years younger, but Michelangelo had certain privileges Da Vinci never had. He had a home, and he had bases where he could work. Da Vinci was an itinerant, essentially. He was a wanderer. He went from one place to another throughout the whole of Italy. So I suppose what I'll do is I'll illustrate two or three things to try and give you a sense of his character. He was taught by a very interesting man called Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio is a sort of proto-Da Vinci. A lot of what his master did was similar, and this is very important throughout this talk, it's very similar to what Da Vinci did. It is dissimilar and it's similar. So you have to sort of imagine them as the same for a while. Imagine that you had a twin, and whatever you can do, perhaps your twin can do it just a little bit better. So you might find that you wear a certain type of jewellery, and your twin, who you don't know, happens to be in the same vicinity, and they've done it in a slightly more stylish way. Or whatever idea you come up with in engineering, or whatever it might be, your twin has come up with the same idea. You might even have borrowed it from you and improved it. So throughout this conversation, I want to imagine you've got a twin. Now this person's somewhat irritating because they can do something not necessarily better than you, but they can do it as well as you, and sometimes you can learn from them. Yeah? Because this is the way the Italian Renaissance masters had to work. They didn't work like Picasso. Picasso will not have a twin. He will be, well, in the case of Picasso, he did, curiously enough, with Braque early on, but it was something that was jettisoned. It had to be, Picasso had to be in a vacuum. So the Renaissance masters, they were not so much in vacuums. They were expected to work alongside each other for a very long period of time. And what is curious about Da Vinci is that he did not leave his master studio when he could have. So by the time he reached about 24 years old, he was a full-fledged master. He ought to have left, but he stayed. So there was something very strong between the bond of him and his master. So I said I was going to illustrate a few points in his career which might give us a sense of his character. Let's start with the great gold sphere that was built in Angelo del Brocchio's studio. You have to picture Florence. In the middle of Florence you've got the Campanile, this huge Duomo, which is built by Filippo Brunelleschi. It's one of the great sort of nostalgic Roman visions of the Renaissance. A lot of rain was crashing for many years because the ceiling of the dome, the hole in the roof, was open until a lantern was placed on it, made of marble. And then above the lantern was supposed to go a huge golden sphere made of copper and gilded. And this sphere would have been perhaps maybe 4 times higher than the ceiling, and at least twice the diameter of, it was huge. And the weight of it was also considerable. So the question was posed, first of all, how was Verrocchio going to put these panels of copper together to make them perfectly smooth? And they developed a sort of early form of welding, which Da Vinci remembered later on in life, and this is very important when we get to his old age, where he was going to do something very strange and extraordinary with his welding technique. But he created this smooth sphere by welding these copper plates together. And then they had to develop some notion of how to get it up to the top, which was a very difficult problem in engineering. There was already beginning monopolies and patents at this point. They were very primitive, but Filippo Brunelleschi had patented them, so they were his, and they didn't work. So what they did is they burned all of their drawings. They would create these extraordinary engineering cranes and different inventions to move things, and then they would burn them afterwards because they were fearful that other masters would copy them. So Da Vinci didn't have the drawings that Brunelleschi's crane, so he had to help Verrocchio make the crane that could take this huge gold sphere up into the heavens on top of the lantern. And that was his first engineering job, and he was 15 years old. So they did it. Now, what's important about that is that it was an overcoming of the elements, it was an overcoming of weight, it was an extraordinary capacity to do something that was beyond human. And this was a theme that went throughout Leonardo's life. He was convinced that he could redirect the forces of nature. So you have a sort of King Lear later on in life, but earlier you have a Prospero. So you have someone who believes that he has his magic of a kind, and he's not ready yet to renounce his books and throw them into the ocean. He will use this magic, and he will do extraordinary things in the vein of Archimedes, give him a lever long enough and he'll move the world. So he gets the sphere up into the sky, hundreds of feet, when he's 15 years old. Then later on, he leaves Florence and goes to Milan and becomes an engineer and works on canals. He does an extraordinary painting called the Madonna of the Rocks. And this is another important point, he does 2, and they're similar. So you've got another mirror going on. You've got Verrocchio, and Da Vinci, and they mirror each other. And then you've got, they don't identically mirror each other, there are differences, but they're incremental differences. They're not huge, they're not vast differences. And then you have later on you have Da Vinci mirroring his own work. Now, one of the reasons is financial and legal cases. He sold it and the church still wanted another one. So there is two Madonna blocks. One is in the Louvre in Paris, and the other one is in the London National Gallery. And there's always been some sort of controversy over the one in the National Gallery in London. But it's interesting that he copied himself, and he didn't again copy himself exactly. They're fairly different. They're similar, like between, but they're different. And then finally, I suppose, Leonardo starts to believe that he's getting older. He's having problems with Milan. He's tried to do two extraordinary things at the same time. He's tried to do the Last Supper in San Pedro de Gracia. At the same time, he's building a giant horse, which was 43 braccia high, it's as high as a house, and with a condottiere on the back. While doing this, horse, up on the roof, hidden in a very secretive manner, he's also building a flying machine. And he's building the flying machine away from the Duomo. There's a cathedral in Milan where people high up, the builders on the cathedral, can see the whole vista, aerial view of Milan. And Da Vinci hides his flying machine from the people up in the cathedral. So he's very secretive, and that's another interesting thing about him. So he's building a flying machine. For what purpose? It's not just to try and glide like Otto Lilienthal or something a little bit down a hill. He wants to fly over the Alps. Yeah. So this is quite ambitious. He wants to fly over mountains and believes that he can do it. He doesn't call it an aeroplane or anything like that. He calls it the great bird. And he's quite strangely imaginative of where he wants to launch the great bird. He wants to launch it from Swan Mountain, which is a mountain near Florence shaped like a swan, which is quite curious. So everything's very sort of ornithological. And then he has this strange dream as well, that when he was a child, a kite flapped its tail in his mouth. So he always had this association with birds and flight. But again, it's this notion that he will challenge, like Prospero, the other elements, and he will command with his magic, with his understanding by Aristotle of all the different powers of nature. So, okay, so the image is that there is man, and he is in the centre of things. This is humanism. And then there are the angels, and then there's God, and they're all in different concentric circles. And right at the bottom, and what is base, is the animal. So humanism is this linear sort of view, and the core is this sort of baseness, and it moves using logic and philosophy, and it's Plato's cave basically, and then you move outwards towards enlightenment, except Da Vinci didn't adopt Plato. That was Michelangelo's thing. He adopted Aristotle, so he had a kind of a strange version of science. It's not the same science at all we have today, which is a whole different subject. It's a 16th century science. And he was thinking in terms of using this knowledge to try and understand what makes us grow old and how to prevent us from growing old. So he would dissect 100-year-olds and discover that their arteries are thinning, and the beginnings of understanding causes of death. He would try and fly. He would believe that he convinced people that he could move churches without destroying the church. So literally a whole church he could move. And he would try and redirect the river Arno. But things started going wrong. The Arno River didn't and wouldn't be redirected from Pisa to stop the Pisans from having water. It was a war against Florence and Pisa. Instead it caused malaria, and a lot of people died because of his ambition. He thought he could move the river. And he failed in moving the river Arno. In actual fact, I think today, even with Hercules cranes and all sorts of technology, it would be really difficult to move the Arno River. I know that they have cut through the Panama, but there were all kinds of disasters with the Panama Canal, and the Suez Canal was an incredible engineering feat. Even Brunel probably couldn't move the iron in Victorian times, never mind Leonardo da Vinci in the 16th century. So his ambition was huge, but perhaps impractical at points. Another example of his huge ambition was when he was at the Vatican. No one quite knows what he was doing with the mirrors. There was a big argument between him and some German mirror makers. And the argument consisted of them having to put together a parabolic mirror that was a curved mirror, which is a really difficult thing to do. And it was a mirror the size of this room. And nobody knows what he was using it for. Some people have these ideas that Archimedes was concentrated rays of the sun, created a sort of laser with a mirror and destroyed the sails of enemy ships and triremes in the distance. Perhaps that's not what Da Vinci was doing. People think now, historians, perhaps they feel that he was trying to create a reflective telescope using the mirror. And that's very strange. This is like many, many years before Galileo. So, and even Galileo didn't have a reflective telescope, and certainly not one with a huge mirror. So if he had created this thing, it would have been another impossibility, but if he had created a reflective mirror, which is technically extremely difficult, he would have had a kind of an early Hubble. He would have been able to see not just the moon, but every single mountain on the moon, which would have been highly problematic for the Vatican at the time. So that's how advanced he was, that's how ambitious he was. But then it all kind of went wrong. The mirrors, the telescope was not made. The last cycle kind of deteriorated. The horse was smashed to pieces by French and German mercenaries, crossbow men, in the sack of Milan. The great battle of Anghiari that he competed with Michelangelo melted because he'd taken a recipe from Pliny and wax melted and tried to dry it after 3 years' work. The Arno River, as I said, was a disaster. And then he caught malaria trying to drain the Pontine marshes in Rome. So he was getting older, and at this point he started doing these very strange drawings of the end of the world, the destruction of all of life on Earth. These incredible drawings of absolute thermonuclear disaster. Basically, it was just the end of everything. It was just complete cosmic chaos. And then he's sort of spotted in Amboise, Loire Valley, with a stroke, with his right arm not working. He was left-handed, so he was still pained a bit. And he was very old, and he carried the Mona Lisa all the way to the King Francis I. And that's when he was last seen. And then his will was to have several hundred candles and various things at his funeral. And there was a tunnel that was built between him and the king so that they could discuss ideas. But he had a trunk full of drawings that were never really going to be printed or turned into engravings. So the whole anatomical treatise that he did, all the different interests, never reached anybody. They were in a vacuum. So all of his inventions, all his ideas had hardly any effect on science and hardly any effect on anatomy. So it was kind of all in vain in a strange way. So that was the great humanist moment, the moment where they thought that they could have faith in people and that they could do extraordinary things, and it was extraordinary things that they were placed there for. So that's the first bit, just about Da Vinci, a little sketch of humanism and its possibilities. And I think the second thing I wanted to talk about, which is a bit more, perhaps a bit more to the point, is this notion of the same. Because everyone has in their mind that Da Vinci is this unique individual, a personality that sits aside from everything else, beyond all of us, separate from us in some kind of world of genius. And we've all been watching the Olympics, and if you look at the way that the runners like Bolt or Mo Farah or someone, they follow similar disciplines, but they all have differences in the way they do what they do when they're competing with each other. But they're doing the same thing. And by doing the same thing, they increase their abilities. So the Renaissance masters and some medieval craftsmen, they worked this way. They worked by doing the same thing. But the differences were small, but we can see that they're quite huge, really. Whereas the contemporary art world works in reverse. It's not supposed to, it gets no points for trying to imitate. So Michelangelo, for instance, to imitate the Greek or the Roman, it would have to be the same as. And then by imitating well, by being a good chameleon, one is given word of Latin. A chameleon is not what Picasso was trying to be. It's a different kind of myth. Picasso's myth was to give the impression that he was like Athena, sort of full-blown from Zeus's forehead, in armour. It was never born. It just appears and it's never born. It's in a way it's unborn. It's just there, and it's Picasso. But when you look closer, you realise, I see there's a bit of influence from Cézanne. There's a here he's inspired by Art Nouveau, and there is clearly some powerful inspiration from the Mediterranean and the Iberian. Clearly there's something from Africa, and so on and so on. So you start piecing it all together, and you realise that Picasso isn't just there. It's a myth. The veil has been moved aside, and you realise that he is actually appropriating. I suppose the only difference between him and a Renaissance studio is that he's hiding the influence, whereas, and sometimes quite perceptibly, so people might ask Picasso, I see in the Demoiselles d'Avignon you've been influenced by African art. And they know that he has, because he's been to the Anthropological Museum in Matisse. But he says no, he's not been influenced by the African. We haven't seen it at this point. He's been influenced by the Iberian Spanish. So he tries to redirect the influence to the Spanish, and to the Mediterranean, rather than to the African. So Picasso attempts not just to disguise where the influences have come from, but he also denies the influences. Whereas Da Vinci doesn't do this. The historians at the time might say that Da Vinci was this genius and he was divine and it came from God and all these different things. But they knew that they were goldsmiths that taught them, and that they were essentially add-ons to these goldsmiths, and they were extending or incrementally extending what had come before. So I suppose in the case of, if you could take someone like Damien Hirst, again, the influences are manipulative in a very interesting way sometimes. The shark, I suppose, is a kind of primitivism. So there's an influence from going all the way back to Alaska, and this mysterious fear of the unknown. There's an influence of science and its decorative look, and even a fascination with death, which you could sort of map back to the macabre sort of Goya and Bacon, Francis Bacon's triptychs, and so on. So or Aztec skulls. So Hirst again is a collage of all of these different things. So finally, I'd like to just talk about the question I want to pose, which is I think what interests me is, what does the same mean? If we cannot ignore our ancestors, if they're there in our language, embedded in the way that we think, in the way that we act, we can try and deny them like Picasso. We can try and pretend, that they've originated from ourselves without pollution from anywhere else. But it's clearly the case that that's impossible. So we are connected like fibres in a rope, like a family resemblance that goes back all the way through history, and we can't deny this connection, that we are the same, and we are similar. So the question I pose is, what if the twin is able to understand the components, what motivates, what is the motive power behind these individuals like Picasso or Leonardo da Vinci? And what if one takes those elements, somewhat like Frankenstein, the scientist, to complete different parts of the different bodies, puts them together a bit, and creates not necessarily what he wanted to be, which was a monster, creates a beautiful being. This is kind of what Da Vinci did. This is what Leonardo did with Verrocchio, and what Michelangelo did with the Gothic and Greek. That's how he created his Pietas, kind of Greek, Roman, Quattrocento Gothic. So I suppose the question is, can one make another Michelangelo? Can one make another Leonardo? Or another Picasso? And what does that mean? And does it have to be human? That's the other question. Does it have to be a human that does this? You have to imagine there's a robot, and it's 100 years from now, and it's working with nanotechnology. And the robot goes to the National Gallery, and it recreates the Madonna of the Rocks that Da Vinci made, particle by particle, from the fibres right at the back of the panel, right to the front 100 glazes. Not just, in every tiny nanoparticle of the molecule of the pigments. So effectively it was the same. Now it hasn't been cured in 16th century air. It hasn't been around Cesare Borgia's staining the fields with blood, but it is effectively indistinguishable from the original. So this robot, let's say, the Japanese make, called Leonardo, which looks like him too, and is quite a piece of theatre. Would Larry Gagosian be interested in it? And the question is, do the galleries, do the contemporary art galleries really need it to be human? The question is really, what value does it have? So that's another thing. The final thing is, let's just say that Da Vinci did come back. Let's imagine he did. He was in Damascus today. They would say, let's just say he decided to come back to Syria. And he was in the middle of it all. And we asked him, well, what is he doing? And the International Herald Tribune tells us that he's painting, very strangely enough, Hillary Clinton. And we said, well, that's going to be terrible. And they said, well, actually, no. What does it look like? Well, it sort of looks like Mona Lisa. It's kind of not. And so Larry Gagosian kind of gets interested, and he says, well, and then all of the colleges, they start saying, Michael Craig Martin starts saying, oh, you can't take this seriously. It's not actually, from our perspective, from our worldview. So we can't actually take this seriously as contemporary art. But there's another school of thought which would say, well, we can. It's extraordinary, and he actually tomorrow he's going to visit the CERN site, and he's particularly interested in all these different things. And this is a fascinating work that he's making. So the question is also about integrity of the art world. What would Gagosian do with iRobot Leonardo? Would he give him a show? And what would he do with the real Da Vinci if he returned, without being steeped in the worldview that we have today? Would he still give him a show? And would these portraits be live? That's the Bye.